Hi, everybody, and welcome to Popcorn Therapy, where the stories we love tell us something about who we are. I'm Julie Peters. I'm a counseling therapist. I'm also a writer. I have a background in storytelling and a special interest in mythology and so on, which is part of the reason why I had to immediately go see the Odyssey as soon as it came out. And right as I went to go see this movie, I had just finished taking a course on men's mental health with Dr. Jett Stone. And after I saw the movie, I thought, wow, I would really love to have a conversation about this. So I emailed him, and sure enough, he's here with me today, and we're going to chat about it. So, Jett, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on. So I am like you, a psychotherapist. I did my training with a lot of veterans. And from that point, I've developed a niche in working with men, especially men who are first timers in therapy or reluctant to enter into therapy, or who have had previous unpleasant therapy experiences. And so alongside with psychotherapy, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Quiet Your Mind. And it's a skill book for overthinking that's geared towards men, although I feel like it could be helpful for anyone who reads it. I have a blog called Souls of Men, where I write about masculinity and topics like fatherhood. And yeah, so this is just a space I've entered into clinically, intellectually, and it's obviously there's a national conversation going on around men, so it fits in quite well. But, where our backgrounds align is in college. Before I even studied psychology, I was an English major. And so the way I got into psychology was through just great books, right? What better thinkers and psychologists, for that matter, than the great authors of the world. I did read the Odyssey when I was in college, in the early 2000s, and have since started listening to the audiobook, actually. Claire Danes, she does the narration of it, and what an emotional, talented narrator that is to read Homer's great epic poems.
Yeah. We will talk about the Odyssey, but I did want to share as well a bit about my history with men and mental health. I'm a card-carrying feminist. I always have been. I've worked a lot with women's health and wrote a book a few years ago on recovering from sexual trauma that's geared towards women. But even as I was doing the research for that book, I was learning a lot about how sexual trauma can affect men in a way that tends to be like underreported, undersupported. And so there's actually a lot in that book about men and other genders, because it's not just about women, of course, that experience. At some point, I attended this event, which was called Manology, 21st Century Masculinity. It was a men's group in Vancouver, and they were opening the group to all genders. And so I showed up and had this kind of experience with this room full of men, led by David Hatfield, who is a wonderful person who does a lot of work with men. And he was actually on the podcast a little while ago. We were talking about the F1 movie, which was really interesting from a masculinity perspective as well. But I showed up to this room of men who were hurting and wanting to connect, and who were so genuine. And it was this weird moment of like, oh, maybe I don't see men as people. Maybe I'm coming from this place of expecting certain things, putting men in certain categories, and so on. And then I became quite involved with that group, and I would co-facilitate the co-gender sessions sometimes. And I was able to learn a lot from David and from the men that I got to know a little bit more, and their stories and where they were coming from. And so now I would say, it's a special interest that I have from a therapy perspective, because I think there's so many ways that feminism should be supporting men, right? If feminism is, there's lots of definitions, but if it's that which wants to take down patriarchy, I guess we can look at the ways that patriarchy harms men in different ways from how it harms women. It's different stories, but it's really important as well. And if we're not healing men, then how can we also heal everybody else, right?
Yeah, what a way to get into this space, through the experience of being with with men, right? Because I think sometimes, just like it's easy to sort of intellectualize it from afar. And I think what you're talking about here is the experiential element of sitting in a circle with men and having your own inner reconciliation, right? Like you just shared it. It's sometimes in psychology, like it's called competency one. It's like, what biases do I hold about women or any gender identity, right? That you sort of have to wrestle with that first before then embarking on at least treating that specific population or that group.
So tell me about, so you studied the Odyssey, or you read the Odyssey, and you're reading it now.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I would have read it with a little bit more, read a little slower, right? And had a chance to enjoy it as I am now. But the Odyssey and that term itself has stuck with me, because the idea of precarious manhood is this sense that it's hard-earned and easily lost. And it's an inner odyssey. It's an inner drama that goes on with a lot of boys and young men, especially. And it's like there's no clear, biomarker of being a man, like there arguably is with women. And so what ends up happening is we sort of have to construct it within ourselves, and have a male chorus or male elders, whoever else is around us, to help us construct it. And in some ways, I always thought of that as kind of an odyssey, the term. But interestingly, that term comes from the book. But when we use it in everyday life, I don't necessarily think of it as always coming from that epic poem by Homer. But it is, because it's like there are so many monsters or obstacles that could thwart you and quickly swipe away your manhood in any given moment, romantically, physically, among other men, right? And so that always interested me psychologically, just that word and stretching it out to different meanings. And so the way that I conceptualize my cases clinically is we all have different odysseys, right? That we've embarked on. And so I think that's a rich literary way of looking at psychotherapy with men. And, I watched the movie as you did, and I'm starting to kind of compare and contrast the book and the movie, which we could talk about as well. I did feel, I'll say one thing about that. I did feel like, and I am feeling as I'm listening to the audiobook, the text is richer and more intimate, especially as Emily Wilson, who's the translator of it, is the one I'm reading. Like the food is opulent and colorful. There's sex scenes. There's Odysseus cries on multiple occasions, and it's intimate, whereas the movie's much more epic. And by the way, I do like that. I'm just saying that that's the tact that Christopher Nolan took, and that I'm kind of feeling as I'm reading it, and I've watched the movie. I don't know if you felt that way too.
Yeah, there are lots of translations of the Odyssey, and Emily Wilson's version. So she was the first female translator of the Odyssey, which is interesting. And Christopher Nolan used her version to create this film. I have heard since then she's furious about being named because she's not happy with the film. I also listened to, so Material Girls is a good friend of mine, has this wonderful podcast that's also about pop culture from more of a critical theory perspective. And they were talking about how various translations of the Odyssey and film adaptations have been used to make certain statements about the values of that time, right? There's always something being said about gender, what it means to be a man. And so I think it's interesting. I haven't read Emily Wilson's version, so I don't know what that feels like from that perspective. But I think there is definitely something being said about what it means to be a man in Christopher Nolan's film. A few of his other films, but this is apparently a bit of a theme, is like a man going on an odyssey, a journey to understand mistakes that he's made in the past, reconcile relationships, things like that. So it's a bit of a theme, I guess, with many of his movies too.
Yeah. Yeah. And which is why this is so chock full of themes and topics to dive into. So yeah, I mean, it's like, where do you begin? Because I read this I read it and I watched it sort of wearing a hat as just a regular guy and also with my clinician's cap too, right? And so there's two different sort of takes.
I also went in watching it just as a person. I felt after watching it, I enjoyed it. Like, I definitely really liked it. I think there were some choices made that were choices. Like, there were just a lot of different directions I think you could have gone with a movie like this. The supernatural elements and the feminine elements were a bit missing for me. Like, Calypso is potentially such a rich story, and she became a bit of a plot point. Circe, I thought was really great. Like, the witch who turns the men into pigs. Like, I think that was really well done, but it was just so short. Like, I wanted more from her and many of the other female characters. And Nolan has been criticized before for sort of using women as a plot point to the man's story and not necessarily giving them their own rich background. This movie barely passes the Bechdel test, which is classically two named women who talk to each other about something other than a man. And it's the moment when Penelope tells Melantho, her slave, essentially, who's been having an affair with Antinous, who's plotting against her. She tells her to go down and be in the fray. She's like, you get down there and be in the fray with the other men. That's the only moment this movie passes the Bechdel test, which is not great. So from that perspective, it's like, well, there was a lot missing for me, and maybe this movie wasn't for me. I feel like it was, very interesting from a masculinity perspective. And that's a story that is worth telling as well. But yeah, I'm curious what you thought about that part of it.
I tend to agree with that. I think there's space for, another interpretation of the Odyssey from the vantage of, say, Penelope. It would be interesting. And you're right in saying that the women were kind of functions of the male psyche rather than the subjects of their own. And that's a problem in so many different movies. I'll give Christopher Nolan credit because I think he did try to tackle some deeper subjects, which we'll get to too, like a moral injury. But when it comes to gender, yeah, it does feel like the women were like instruments of wisdom or a seductress, obstacle or refuge, like Circe and Calypso, or in the case of Penelope, like to be reclaimed, right? Or defended, Helen of Troy, right? That we'll go to war to defend a woman, but we're going to really explain her personhood in more detail. So I think it's totally true. They're functions of the plot and of the male psyche. And, he brought in more diverse characters in terms of gender identity, in terms of race and ethnicity, which is great because it's like a modern interpretation of a story that's been interpreted a thousand times. So it's like totally malleable in terms of who represents what. And so he could have done more in terms of giving the female characters more depth. Yes.
So maybe let's just go with scenes that you thought were particularly interesting from this perspective. What did you remember, especially from that perspective, as a clinician?
Yes.
Or as a man. Well, either way.
Yeah, we'll go in and out of those different parts of my identity. The thing, there's a few different scenes, some small, some bigger. The stringing of the bow, if that's how you describe what that was, only Odysseus could string the bow. And that was such an important piece of the plot, especially at the end when they were trying to figure out, who's going to get Penelope. And at first I was like, oh, that is such a classic masculinity performance, right? That was my first interpretation of it. Who's strong enough to, pull this bow across and actually, get it onto get it so it can be used. And then I was like, you know what? In some ways, it's less about strength. I kind of moved and more about like a man's tools, and there is that element of masculinity, of like the toolbox that they have. Everyone has an uncle or a father who has their coveted toolbox with their special hammer or their, I'm not a very handy person, but I certainly know that in my own father and the men in my life. And so it's like, maybe it was just that he knew how to tweak the bow just in the right way, as you would with like, a trusty wrench or whatever else. And so I just love that part of it, because you could at first impression just see it as like a pissing contest, but it was more than that, because you have to bend it in a certain way. And he was an older man at that point when he did it, right? So I'm sure there were other suitors there who had more physical strength than he.
My husband and I were joking that Odysseus must have childproofed the bow and not told any of the adults how to get past the childproofing of the bow. Because classically, he's not the strongest, right? And he teaches, that's a lesson that comes through him to his son through his mentor or whatever, that you don't have to be the strongest, but you should be the smartest or the cleverest, right? Like there are ways to pull forward these qualities of yours. And yeah, I think from a masculinity perspective, part of what you're talking about and what I experience too with my clients and just in the world is like the box, I guess we can use that term for what a man should be, is pretty narrow, right? It's like you have to fit into these certain things. And if you're not strong enough to string this bow, then you could lose your man card is another phrase that you used in the course. Mm-hmm. And so teaching Telemachus or, a boy child, if you can't, meet the pissing contest in this certain way, like what other qualities are you going to bring to maintain your man card, to make sure that people still respect you and so on?
Yes. And, to keep your man card, or you could just say it another way, to like ensure your worthiness and lovability, to use it in more of like therapy terms, it's like you have to have a trade, or you have to have a role on the team. And what you find with a lot of boys and young men is that it's like they don't need to be the captain of the football team. They don't need to be the hero. Even having like a supporting role where you're needed. And so that idea of neededness is important too. I wanted to add into that picture is that, like if I don't feel like I have a needed role on the team, as even if it's the locker room guy, as a jokester or as a, physical strength or intellectual strength, it's like, how will I survive my Odyssey, or the Odyssey into manhood? And so you're certainly onto something there. And that if you don't perform, if you don't earn your way onto a team or onto, somewhere into manhood, then it's like you could slippery. It could fall away. And every so often there are these like peak moments in men's lives where they feel like it's at risk. It could be just driving and not knowing where you're going. It could be a bar fight where you don't back down. It could be dating romantically, or when it comes to physical intimacy and sex and the expectations of what you're supposed to be able to do and always wanting it as a man, right? And then maybe you don't, or maybe you're afraid, so there's so many ways that your sense of being a man can fall away. And I think that's one of the things that is a core difference of many when it comes to the socialization of femininity, which you can speak to much better than I, but it's that it's not at risk of vanishing in any given moment in the same way that masculinity is. And that's not like a tiny violin thing. It's just a fact of socialization, of how we are reared as boys.
when I had David Hatfield on the podcast, he had some really interesting things to say about initiation and cultures that initiate men more formally than we tend to in our culture today, North American culture, like however you want to put it, modern culture. And one of the things he said about initiation was that it was a way for a boy to learn the specific tools and skills that a man needs to face the problems of that time or that culture. And David was kind of speaking to how a lot of boys and men today feel kind of lost in that way. Like, what is my purpose here? You know, what can I offer? And when you said, you know, the man card being the statement of worthiness and lovability, like, ooh, yeah, that's kind of what it is. It's like, I want to feel like I have something to offer to this culture, but I don't know what that is. Like, we're in a very confusing time around that. And then the other thing I was thinking of as you were talking about it is this idea of ick, like this, the cultural term of ick is, if you look at it a certain way, it's often when a man is doing something like he fumbles a ball, let's say, and then someone will say like, oh, I got the ick when he did that. And maybe, and I would love your thoughts on this, that ick is actually a moment of losing the man card, right? And that's something that women who are using this kind of language are participating in, right? Like this rejection when a man is showing any moment of vulnerability, right?
Yes, I have spent some time thinking about ick because, like,
tell me,
yeah, because there's the ick factor is a good example also of how the patriarchy can work, in that it's like we're all involved. We all can have that disgust at someone. And a lot of times the ick, if it is a form of disgust towards someone's behavior or action, often comes from our own internalized sense of, in this case, gender roles and gender norms. And so I think we place that upon that person in that moment. In a way, our brain quickly does this gymnastics of saying, oh my gosh, if I were the one who threw that wobbly spiral with a football, I would feel humiliated. But it's also like a lack of self-awareness too. So it's, you're recognizing that the person is doing something maybe without the self-awareness also of knowing how socially unconventional or weird or odd it is. And so it's actually more complicated than just disgust, and more complicated than just saying, oh, the good disgust I feel I'm projecting onto that person. It's also like this person is like doesn't know themselves well enough to know that they shouldn't have done that. Or it could be that that person is bold and has self-confidence and is like, you know what, I don't know how to play catch that well, but I'm going to still throw a ball because I'm having fun doing it. So screw you, right? It could run in different ways. It's more complicated because sometimes it's a accurate appraisal of someone's lack of self-awareness. And sometimes it's an appraisal of somebody's like free-spiritedness and like confidence to be vulnerable and not necessarily like have a lot of anxiety about it.
Right. And one of my theories about that, and I don't know if this is, universally true, but sometimes the ick for me can come up from an attachment perspective. Like, this man's getting too close, or he's too intimate, or he likes me too much. Like, for some women, that can be an ick, right? And I think some of that is the gender role thing of, he's not masculine enough or whatever it is. But, if a woman has some attachment issues with, that feeling of, if someone likes me, there must be something wrong with them, like that sort of avoidant attachment or whatever it is. Then I think that can be where the ick comes from, is a bit of a rejection because of the fear of intimacy, right? Because intimacy requires vulnerability. Intimacy requires seeing someone as a whole human being, including their flaws, right? And if they fumble a football or whatever it is, it's like, oh, you're not a fantasy anymore. Like, you're not this distant, version of a man that I can, like from afar, but never actually access.
Yes. And as you talk about that, it's, what I see clinically in men is a performance anxiety, because they know that vulnerability is a wanted thing. It's a human thing. It's a natural thing. But there's a fear if they show this much amount of it, but not this much amount of it, or not the right, that they could suddenly be the object of someone's ick. And that it's like, it can feel like you're walking a tightrope for a lot of the men that I work with. And I started have recognized in myself where it's like, if you just think about dating, it's like sometimes it's like, oh, I'll pay the bill. And then sometimes it's like you say something that you shouldn't have said. And the internal dialogue within a lot of young men dating speaks to that a lot. It's like
So
trying
stressful.
to walk the
Yeah.
tightrope because they're trying to not be a hard ass, but also show vulnerability, but not too much. And so you can see where that goes.
Yeah. And Odysseus in this movie, and maybe in the book as well, is complicated in that way. I think we do potentially see some vulnerability with him. One thing that I had heard is that Nolan liked Emily Wilson's translation because she presents him as such a complicated man. Because there are different ways of looking at this story, right? Is he sort of an ideal masculine man for the time? Or is he kind of a failure that is facing up to that? So part of what was happening with Odysseus was that he was playing his role as soldier. Right? One way that we can frame this is if patriarchy wants women to be baby machines, patriarchy wants men to be soldiers, expendable soldiers. And I feel like one of the things that really stood out to me when I was watching this film is the endlessness of the men, like quote unquote men that were following Odysseus. It was just like, there are just so many men, like they just keep coming and they keep dying and it keeps not mattering. Like they just keep going and going and going. Right. And so, part of what was happening with Odysseus was that he was following Agamemnon's orders. He was doing his job as a soldier. Right. And he was using that tool, which is his cleverness, to come up with, a way of breaching the walls of Troy. I don't know how much of this was in the poem, but towards the end there's this feeling of that was really horrible that I did that. That was a real violation of like the rules of humanity. So basically he's like meeting his man card requirement by doing the soldier thing and then finding out that he had deeply betrayed himself and everyone else by doing that, right? I wonder if you have that quote. You shared it. I love that quote as well, from Bell Hooks, about the way that patriarchy steals, like it requires this self-mutilation of men. Like in order to fit into patriarchy, you have to mutilate these parts of yourself. I can't remember the exact quote, but there's a beautiful way that Bell Hooks framed it in her book, The Will to Change, it's called, I think. So yeah, do you have that quote or do you remember that piece?
I think you captured it. I mean, the first sort of act of patriarchy is psychic mutilation, right? It's a very violent way of putting it. I don't want to butcher it either, but it is a beautiful quote and a gory quote too. And I think it just captures the intensity of that. So what you're talking about is that, and this is a hero's journey, yes, but it's also a veteran reconciling with what he did. And yes, that's the moral injury part. And that's just basically a fancy term for saying, a type of trauma where someone has violated their own sense of right and wrong. And I did work with this myself, and I still do with veterans in the VA system. I'm no longer working in the VA, but I still work with moral injury. And I think it makes Odysseus so much more complicated when we think about the moral injury component of this. So I think of a scene in the beginning, right, when he's holding his baby, and it's kind of a flashback before he left to go sack Troy. And it's like such a normal moment of him as a father, and then he goes off on this big journey. And I think what Christopher Nolan captures in this movie is that like he can be this tender person, and he wants to return back to Penelope and Telemachus, but when he does, as we know at the end, it's like he can't stay. He has to get, I don't hate to, ruin the ending for people, but like he can't stop doing. He can't, he can't stop doing, he can't just be. And so a lot of times with like moral injury, it's so hard to sit with yourself, especially if you think yourself to be a monster, let's say, for creating this whole ploy to have a Trojan horse and manipulate people and all the people he killed and the lives of the men that he was responsible for who died. And so in some way you see him like wanting to come back to that moment of tenderness of being the dad, but he can't. And he's just wrestling with, you know, how could I have done that? And I mean, that's such a big piece of this movie that Christopher Nolan honed in on. And it really speaks to just veterans in general, but modern day veterans, like who are, even when they get home, they're still trying to get home. And, you know, I worked with Vietnam veterans who came out of that war conflict, terrible, with so many moral injuries. Like if I look across the caseload of people I've worked with, and that they came home and maybe they're doing a lot of drugs, right? Which is kind of reminds me a little bit of the Lotus years. Like we could talk about that too. And a lot of them were plagued with addiction, and they worked and they worked and they worked and they worked, and then they became of retirement age and they stopped working, and then suddenly they're faced with, you know, in full high definition of the things that they did, and they're coming into therapy. And so part of therapy is the exposure component, especially when it comes to trauma, and they're having to face it down and make meaning of it and slow it all down in therapy if they stay, which is not always the case. And so we don't see Odysseus dealing with his moral injury in a therapeutic way. He's going from one, you know, in the case of the poem, book to book to book, to different scenes, to Cyclops, to, you know, to speaking with a goddess, to, you know, Poseidon, and he, you know, gives him unbearable amount of barriers on the sea. And it just goes from one thing to the next. He can't be still. And even, as we know at the end, he can't even be still in more domestic life, which is what he theoretically wants.
Yeah. And I do think like the lotus flowers are a classic metaphor for substance use, right? The one place he did stay for 7 years was a place where he was consuming something that allowed him to forget, right?
Yes. Yes. Maybe
and that was a bit of a change from the book, right? Because in the book, I think it's his men who eat the lotus flowers and he doesn't. But interesting that Nolan chose to have Odysseus consume the lotus flowers in this way. Like we see him in the movie kind of like he's really wanting to, he loves it, you know, like he really likes it. Because it gives him ease from his pain.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as much as I would have wanted more from Calypso, she did kind of provide a little bit of a therapist, you know, mom, caretaker kind of, you know, perspective there, where she does kind of say like, I was able to fix your body, but you weren't ready to face, you know, what had happened to you. You weren't ready to remember. And, you know, I think that's something that comes up sometimes in therapy. I'm sure it comes up for you too, where you have to titrate, right? Like people aren't ready necessarily to go right into the heart of the trauma. Like, you know, they can go to the edge of it maybe and then come back. They have to, you know, focus on safety first. And things like substance use and dissociation. I mean, my perspective on addiction is, you know, like the traditional perspective of addiction is like quit the substance, like just quit, like use your willpower and quit. But for so many people, the addiction is what's keeping them alive. You know, it's the thing that rescues them from the pain that they don't trust themselves to feel on whatever level. And so I think it's an approach to addiction. I mean, I don't think that's something that we've solved, obviously, but that it might need to be gentler. It might need to be more trauma informed. It might need to be kind of the way Calypso was like, you know, take a little bit more of the lotus flower tonight so that you can get some sleep. And, you know, let's do this slowly because the memories will come back, but let's not do it all at once because you're going to, you know, fall apart. So I don't know. That was kind of
a good
interesting.
take. It is. I like that. I like that take on it. That it was like a harm reduction in a way, right? Like get some sleep and, you know, we're not going to do this all in one foul swoop. A lot of, moral injury is the belief systems that you have about yourself, others, and the world. And I really appreciate working with it. It's very hard to do, though, until someone is substance free. And when you're in the VA system, let's say, you have to do a lot of pre-treatment, as we used to call it, or still do, but like getting somebody ready to face the demons, or at least be able to slow down and make meaning of it. And substance use is a great avoidance tool. And that's what PTSD, a lot of it is avoidance, as you know. So it's meaningful work if you get to it. And I will say it's very hard to get to it, especially with men. And a lot of the issues you see with veterans is like, once you start to touch upon the sore spot and conjure up what they experienced and saw, the natural instinct is to flee. And so you have to kind of build that into the treatment. And, good luck doing that with Odysseus if anyone would ever see him in the therapy room.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if my idea of this is updated, but I feel like the statistics are that men suffer from addiction at higher levels than women do, right? That's still true?
I do believe it's true. What I do know is true is that men have like more negative outcomes from addiction, like when it comes to like drunk driving, let's say, or like aggression or hurting themselves, or like homicides related to it. So they tend to drink more recklessly, would be the way to put it, putting themselves and others at risk. But I do think that they are more likely
as Odysseus
to
does.
use it. Yes.
A lot of people at risk around Odysseus. Yeah.
That's right. And to your point, that like so many of his men just like die. Like we don't even know the names of those characters in film, just because it's like ding, 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 right? And that's what, sadly, the military industrial complex, not just the soldiers, but also the victims of the drones and the warfare too, it just becomes expendable. And I do think, though, that young men especially these days do feel like they're dispensable, just in the sense of like, oh, does anyone really care how I do? I do hear that, maybe not in those words, but it does come out. And so that's part of the male psyche, certainly, too.
Yeah, and I think there's another statistic somewhere about how men complete suicide a lot more often than women do. The attempts might be similar, but men will tend to follow through with it more often.
Yep.
And it's a pretty big risk for a lot of young men these days.
Suicidality is a risk factor, and in younger men are now becoming more at risk. It used to be like deaths of despair of middle-aged men, but the number of young men who are dying by suicide is tragic and just rising.
Yeah.
And so
and my understanding of suicidality is it often comes from a lack of belonging and feeling like a lack of purpose, like I'm not useful, I'm not needed, right, by anyone.
And perceived burdensomeness too, right, is the other element of it. And then access to means.
Right. Access
as well.
To means, yeah.
And so all those three aspects create like psychic pain that men fall prey to and feel like they don't have any way out of.
So I have two boys. I have two little boys. My oldest is 5. And I mean, the baby can't really speak that much yet, but the 5-year-old is so sensitive, so sensitive, so deeply feeling, and I've also learned some studies recently that have shown that boy babies, they're actually less likely to survive in the womb. So like girl embryos are somehow hardier. And then that boys will cry more, they'll need more cuddling and attention, that they're actually more sensitive, and that little girls are more able to self-regulate earlier for some reason. And I was talking to another boy mom that I know, and we were sort of talking about how there is this built-in sensitivity, like to all of us, of course, but especially if we think of men as these sort of sensitive little boys on the inside, and then in a culture where there is very little options for how to deal with that, who to talk to, even going to therapy is stigmatized for men in a lot of ways. Like you can't ask for help as much. It feels riskier. You could lose your man card, all of these things. That addiction becomes maybe one of the only options, avoidance, shutting down. How do I find a way to make my mask very stoic and still, because that's what is expected of me. And there are these big emotions inside that I'm struggling with, right?
Yes. Well, you're seeing it firsthand with raising a boy who's sensitive. I was that same way. And, over the course of time and into adolescence is when your masculinity starts getting much more policed, like in a heavier way. And then eventually it becomes internalized, right? Like,
Right.
As a 40 something, I don't have friends who are saying, like, you're such a wuss, as much, like, be more of a man. Like, they're not saying that anymore, but the damage, is done in your youth, right? And so it's internalized. So the voices are but when it comes to addiction in this piece, is that it's a form of avoidance, it's a form of numbing. Oftentimes it's a solution to a problem. But before all of that, it's a tool of camaraderie. It's a tool of masculine performance.
Belonging.
Yeah, and belonging, absolutely, right? Who can drink more and maybe you're not the smartest guy in the room, but if you can chug 5 beers very quickly, you are going to have, all the status that a jock has, let's say. So addiction plays a very, in drinking especially, because it can be used as sport for men more than it does for young women. And so it becomes a way of proving yourself. In even older, men love intellectualizing about whiskeys and wines. It becomes it becomes this thing that you can you can prove your masculinity around. Not to distract from like the actual fun elements of having a drink and knowing things about whiskey and wine. Like, I don't want to like poo-poo all of it, but some of it begins that way and ends up becoming a solution to a deeper problem. That is
an unsustainable solution.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the Trojan horse. As I was thinking about this term, man box, I was very moved and interested by the way Christopher Nolan thought, okay, what would it literally be like if a bunch of soldiers were to get inside of a horse and try to get that horse through the gates and so on? And he shows a lot of, several days of being stuck inside this horse. They're on the tides. And so some of the men at the bottom of the box are literally drowning because the water is coming in. They're giving the reeds to try to, get them to breathe under the water and so on. But Odysseus, that's one of the many ways that these endless men just are dying. They're not eating I don't know if they're even drinking water. They must have some way of surviving for a couple of days. But yeah, they showed a lot of that. And even the moment when Odysseus finally comes out of the Trojan horse, he kind of stumbles because he's not been moving for several days and he kind of has to get like his muscles back working again. So I would love your thoughts about that as this metaphor of the man box, this place where you have to stay inside, you have to stay quiet, right? Like they had to really pretend that they weren't suffering in there. There was a moment when, a soldier was putting the sword in to make sure there was nobody in there. One of the guys got the sword in his shoulder and he had to stay absolutely silent. He could not express that pain. I feel like it's a pretty effective metaphor for that. Like, what do you think?
I thought it was one of the more gripping parts of the movie, just cinematically. Like, I really enjoyed that. As terrible as I guess it is, like, how do you? And I always wondered, like, how big was this Trojan horse? Like, how they pull it in, like logistically, and we use that word so often in our daily language. Let's Trojan horse some broccoli into my kid's diet, right? Like it's used, in everyday language, and then it's also used in business and all over. But I think your interpretation of it when it came to the man box, it hadn't occurred to me. But, when you sent me an email, I was like, you know what that is? There's something there. Like the ones at the bottom, if you think in terms of pecking orders or a hierarchical thing, like the ones at the bottom are getting shit on, maybe literally.
Yeah, quite literally. Yeah.
Right. They're in the, they're suffocating. And then the ones at top have a little bit better. And I'm sure the ones at the top are the best fighters. And the ones who are least dispendable, most indispendable. And, it's confining in some ways, or in a lot of ways, actually. It's very confining. And in the short term, there is, like, when you think about the man box, like having done that, right? Having been in that confined space, and being in the man box does have a function, right? It helps you, in this case, sack Troy, or, it can help you, protect and provide. And sometimes the risks and sacrifice, extreme sacrifice and survival, talk to people in working class fields, like, can have such great benefit. I'm not saying that sacking Troy was great for history. I don't really know, but probably not. But like, there is a utility, there's a function to the man box, actually. And that's part of what I try to emphasize in therapy, like your stick-to-itiveness, your bravery, your valor helps you in so many ways get the family that you have right now. But then it's the long-term costs of it that we have to think about too. So in the short term, it helped them achieve a military objective, the Trojan horse. But in the long term, it left a wake of pain, for the soldiers that were mentioned in other Homer books. But for Odysseus, it left him with a moral injury. He was as a soldier, then he was the brilliant trickster. When we think about like archetypes of masculinity, he was able to create this ploy and pull it off. That's such a feather in your cap, right? You get 100 mana cards for that, for right. for pulling that off. But then that happens, and then it's over, and then you're just alone by yourself in your bed thinking about life and what you did, and
having flashbacks to
yes,
the losses of that time. Yeah,
right. And you don't for what you gained is no comparison for what you end up losing. And I've seen that in so many different iterations. But that scene, my gosh, how cool. I also think, and this is the guy in me, I love sort of special forces movies, right? Like where you're going into, coming into somewhere in the darkness, and you have to be highly trained. And there's just something about that the action hero part of me, the little boy in me, still can't get enough of in my 40s.
Yeah. And along with that, I think another thing that I was thinking about later was these endless men, when they go to Circe's island, she transforms them into pigs. Men as pigs is a cliche.
Mm-hmm.
And then when she turns them back, she says, back into your disguises. Right. So she's saying you are pigs, and she has a narrative, and it's, I think, not the only one, of your men are primal beasts, and they're always going to go with their primal urges, and, you should know who they really are, which is pigs. Right. And then later they are brought to the island with the sun god's cattle, and Odysseus is told, your men will slaughter the sun god's cattle, and they will be killed for that. And Odysseus kind of wants to believe better of them, right? He's like, I want to protect them. I don't want them to die. And also when they come to that island, they're like, we're starving. We need to stop. We need water. We can't keep going. From that primal perspective of our survival requires us to stop. And so he makes them promise that they won't slaughter this cattle, and they promise, and he says they held that promise for a long time, right? But the winds will not change to let the boat off the island, and they end up slaughtering the cattle, and they say, we'd rather drown than starve. And so I feel like there were these forces that were insisting that the men prove that they are these primal pigs. Right. And we could see the characters of the men like trying to be better than that. And I feel like there was something about that in the way that there is this narrative about men as pigs. Men are foundationally bad. Like, there's a lot of hatred against men, which comes from a long history of violence and so on. Like, I kind of get where that's coming from as well. But this characterization of men as bad, evil. Right. And then here was this movie where these men were trying to be people. I think especially we kind of get to know Odysseus's second in command, who we come to like and appreciate. And we see him making complex choices and so on. And these men are just forced to prove it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something. Right. And it was sort of tragic to see that, because I don't think that's who the men really were, but they were sort of forced into that. And I feel like there's something really resonant about that for me in this moment of masculinity in 2026.
Yes. And you're speaking about it from maybe the female perspective of, sort of the nasty stereotype of all men are pigs, which we've all heard. But there's also that impression from within the worst parts of, so we'll call it the manosphere, who glorify that among men. Yes. Right. We are we are meant to take what's ours in women, right? To dominate and to control, and to be paternalistic. That's our right to do it, right? That's the nature of things. That's what's essential within us. And so that's interesting, because that's where some of the gender essentialism comes in from both ends. It's maybe women saying, "Oh, all men are pigs naturally, innately, biologically," right? And then we'll give you the disguise of being a man. And within the worst parts of sort of the male communities, I'm thinking online, which we call, the manosphere, not all of it's bad, but in the worst alleys, dark alleys of the manosphere, you'll have folks peddling this idea of like, if you want a woman, you have to be dominant, and you have to have big muscles and expensive cars, and this very simplified, caricatured version of being this impulsive risk taker. And sometimes the impression in young men who are trying to figure out who they are as men is, oh, women want a dominant man. But no, they just want a self-confident, assertive man, right? It's like you could see where they're not looking for a pig, who just, is disgusting. And so sometimes there are some men who can't find that line between what is dominant or what is too much and what is too passive and too meek and not showing assertiveness. And so this scene,
and we'll get the ick.
Yeah, we'll get the ick. That's right. This scene is a caricature. And gosh, what was the name of that woman who raised the pigs? The character, I don't.
Cersei.
Cersei.
Cersei the witch. Yeah.
Yeah. Cersei was. I mean, it was one of the best pieces of acting I've seen in a while. Like, she was just so good in that scene, and I think it was a scene that captured a lot because they still had their brains intact, but they were stuck in the bodies of a pig. Which is a metaphor right there too. it is. And as we talk about it, it makes me think is like, there is this pressure, call it from the man box or the rules of how you're supposed to be, is like, you have to act a certain way, even if your better judgment, even with the brain within your skull is urging you not to.
And addiction can feel like that too, right? Like, I think for a lot of people, an experience of addiction is like, I want to stop, but I can't. It's like it's like there's a part of me that is trying to make a rational decision, but my body is just doing this thing that it's habitually does. And it's like, there's this, one of the strategies that I use in therapy is IFS, this idea that like we have different parts, that are all kind of working together in these different ways. But addiction from an IFS perspective would be like a firefighter, right? Like it's coming in to put out the fire of potentially feeling something negative, and we can't always control that firefighter. It's very, very strong. It will come in and sort of take over from those parts of us that are saying, I value my family, I don't want to hurt anyone, or whatever it is. But there can be that internal struggle with these parts that it feels like we don't have control over, right?
Yes, that along with the pig scene and the siren scene, which is very short in the movie, but maybe longer in the book, was like, is that this idea that you're a slave to your impulses, and that you could be as much of a trickster, as much as a hero, as much you could show as much bravery as you want, but at the end of the day, when there's something that's seductive, you're going to risk it all to go get it. It's such a foregone conclusion that Odysseus had to tie himself, for those who've seen the movie, they'll know that, like, he literally had to strap himself to the mast of the ship, not to fall into the hands of the seductresses. And so there is something there that we're talking about. Maybe it's impulsivity, which is a symptom of many different psychological issues, but like, it is an element of masculinity too. It's like shoot from the hip, right? Just go with what you want. And Odysseus knew that he didn't have that self-control. He couldn't delay the gratification, to use a therapy term. So he had to change his environment in order to be able to do so. Is it therapeutically the best way of doing it, tying yourself up? No. I mean, I don't know about you. I haven't said, you know what? Put yourself in handcuffs next time you walk by a liquor store, right? Or if there's,
and for some people with addiction, it's like you can't be with that friend that, tends to tempt you. For some people, it's helpful to put in sort of external boundaries for themselves so that they can at least slow themselves down before they make that choice, or don't have alcohol in the house or something like that, right? Like those can be ways, I guess, of tying your hands.
Yes. What we're talking about here is there's this deeper, darker impulse. And I get a sense of that from some men. Like, for example, I'll see a young guy in therapy who's thinking about marriage, and we'll be talking about fidelity or infidelity. And it's like, I don't know if I can be with one woman for the rest of my life. And I'm sure there's women who talk about that as well. But sometimes they'll use some like lazy evolutionary argument, like, weren't men, supposed to have many, many different partners? Like, how could this be? Like, I love this person, but is it viable? Like those are the sort of questions that you do get. Like these baser desires are at some point going to take over and ruin their marriage. Or I'm fated because my father was abandoning, that I'm going to this part of me is just going to come out and I'll have no control over it and I'll harm my kids. So these are definitely things that come up in therapy.
Yeah. What other scenes were interesting for you?
I enjoyed the dog in this. Like, I've had a dog for the last 2 years. I didn't grow up with them. I've become a dog person, but it becomes he was there from the beginning, and you see him, this dying dog who's like struggling to stay alive until the end. And the dog they're like the watcher of the arc of a man, man's best friend, their woman's best friend too. But like the cliche is that, sometimes it's easier for men to show vulnerability to an animal than it is to their spouse or to their kid. It's easier. It's a medium for which they can be tender and safely tender and sensitive, where it feels like that is too risky maybe in other parts of their life.
Yeah, and as you're saying that too, I'm thinking about the plot device of the dog was recognition, right? Odysseus came home in disguise, but the moment his son realizes who he is, it's when the dog sees, oh, it's my master, and then he is able to die because his master came home. And so I think there's something about that, like the animal in all the ways that you just described, is the one that knows Odysseus like at his heart, right? Not his disguise, not his mask, but like who he really is. There's something very sweet about that.
I love that scene. Yeah. I love the theme of men at sea as well too. It's always something that's captured my imagination.
I did like the way nature felt so much more powerful than the man, Odysseus, anybody. The way he has to get home is actually ultimately through surrender. He has to just go on a raft and let Poseidon take him. And that's the only way that he can get home, is by not controlling everything, which is what he's tried to do, right, in his Odysseus way, but actually to let go. And like from a therapeutic perspective, that comes up all the time, right? Like what happens if we let go of control? What happens if we acknowledge the aspects of life that we don't get to choose, right? Then how can that help take us home, right?
Yes. And it makes me think, because in the case of this book and the time period, it's like the gods had so much power. They could turn on waves, turn off waves, bring in a scary monster and turn it away, or make things easy or make things hard. And, maybe the gods in disguise as a human. It makes me just think about like the layers of control and how God comes into that. It's that sometimes you do believe that there is a higher power, and it helps you give up, like let go in some ways. That having a spiritual practice can let you radically accept, as we would say as therapists, right? Like surrender, and other times not. And then there's Zeus's law that comes into it too, which is so interesting because it's a code.
Yeah, Zeus's law was interesting. The idea that we should give strangers hospitality because they might be a god in disguise. Disguises were a big theme. Like Odysseus is in disguise a lot, which again, it's that mask of masculinity, I guess, is one way of looking at that we've talked about, the cleverness and so on. As you're talking about moral injury, it's not exactly the same, but often when I'm working with trauma, I will talk about spiritual wound, which I think is partly what you're talking about with moral injury. It's like the reason something might be traumatic is because it changes the foundational way that you see the world. Right? If something bad happens, but it still fits in with your concept of what the world is, it won't be held as traumatic, right?
That's right.
But if, for example, this institution was supposed to protect me when I got hurt, but instead I was rejected, right? Or exiled or not believed, that can mess with your idea of what the world is. And so I think, spirituality is, it's a bit of a niche that I'm in. Like a lot of people do come to me because I read tarot and I have a little bit more of a spiritual perspective with a lot of those things. But I think ultimately we all need some way to believe in the world or what we're doing here. Even if it's atheism, it's nothing. Like that's still a belief. And I think that when we go through a trauma, often we have to reorganize the way that we understand the world, right? And if you are coming from this sort of Judeo-Christian perspective of good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And if I'm a good enough person, I'll be rewarded. And from a masculinity perspective too, right? If I stay in the man box and I keep my man card and I do everything correctly as a man, I should have money and the reward of, a woman who loves me and lots of sexual partners or whatever it is. That's actually not how the world works, especially in 2026. Those things are changing. And so that can be one of those ways that things have to shift. And it can be uncomfortable to really look at what are the assumptions I'm making about the world I'm living in and what could be a different way of looking at that I can trust.
Yes. And it makes me wonder what Odysseus's like prior beliefs were before like the Trojan War, right? When I think of moral injury, I think of it in like two ways. One is that an event or events radically disrupt the way that you see the world, yourself, and others. Or it radically confirms, yes, the world is an unsafe place, just like I thought before. So it over reinforces. And so those are two pathways to moral injury. And it makes me think that Odysseus was probably his worldview was disrupted by the Trojan War. Oh, if I go and fight and I can be a trickster and I can figure this out, I'll have all the glory and I'll be able to come home with relief. Only to find out that he sacks Troy and it's an incredible feat and he feels terrible about himself.
And horrifying and traumatic.
Right. And he's agonized. And so to me, that's where the disruption of it. It's not the world I thought it was.
So I thought Agamemnon was interesting in that way. So I watched the movie twice. Agamemnon, I never really saw his face, right? He always had that beautiful helmet on with the golden spine at the back that was very intimidating and very beautiful. And even in the scene where he comes home expecting to be celebrated, he's murdered by his wife because he killed their daughter. He sacrificed their daughter in exchange for favorable winds from Poseidon. So I think if you look at that metaphorically, here is a man who is doing everything right according to his code of things. The war is the most important thing. The glory is the most important thing. The ambition is the most important thing, to the point that I will sacrifice my family, which is something that I think a lot of men have to do or feel they have to do or end up doing. Women have this experience as well, of course, in other genders, that, you know, you have to make this trade-off between my ambition and my career and the sacrifices that I make for my family and so on. So he literally sacrifices his child. In so many modern marriages, resentment grows, right, when there is a trade-off like that that's not resolved between the partners and so on, and that can often end the relationship. So here it's made literal, where she actually kills him. So this idea that Agamemnon did everything right according to that idea of what the world is supposed to be and what it means to be a man and so on, and he suffered greatly for that huge loss, that literal mutilation, I guess, not the psychic mutilation we were talking about before.
Yeah, he was, you know, such a terrifying looking figure, just dominant and overbearing. You don't exactly know who he is, but he's wearing this incredible armor. And what a metaphor, because I know men in my life who are so intimidating, right? Especially as a kid looking up to, like, the vantage point of Agamemnon is from looking up. And, you know, as seeing that and not really knowing what's in the inside, there's a mystery to who this man is. He's just doing everything. He's playing the part of warrior so well. And I think sometimes that's what you see in, like, the modern strivers of today, right? Maybe they're not as intimidating as Agamemnon, but, like, you know, they, especially with a lot of them, you know, the men I work with, let's say in Wall Street, or these strivers, these, you know, in New York City, it's a city full of, like, type A people willing to just grind and put everything else off to build the biggest sand pile they can possibly build. And so in some ways it's like, yeah, they're not going to kill their kids. That's an extreme in the modern day, but they're not going to really know who their kids are sometimes, or they're going to leave the caregiving to a spouse who is, you know, reluctantly or sometimes more than willing to do that. And so in some corners of the US and in a lot of other places, like, there still very much is, like, I have to be a provider, warrior, protector. But in doing so, you're doing, like, only half the job. Maybe you're bringing home money, but you're also not providing and protecting your family in other ways. And there are oftentimes tragic outcomes to that. So
absolutely.
Well said on the Agamemnon part.
And maybe one of the pieces that's so attractive for some men about those dark corners of the manosphere is the idea that you will be rewarded, right? Like, there is a reward here, because in real life, that's complicated, right? It's like,
yes,
so sometimes maybe and sometimes not. And, you know, I think this is something that my husband deals with. Like, we're both working, we have these young children, and there is this pressure, right? Of, like, I have to be the best worker and available all the time for that. And I'm also expected to be the best husband and father in a way that like previous generations didn't have that expectation. Like I think dads of this generation, there's more that's being asked of them.
Yes.
Which often the women, the moms are like, welcome to that. But at the same time, it's like, well, there were no models, right? And like, what is this supposed to look like? And what are the costs and where are the rewards? Like that can be really hard and really challenging, right? I think that's a very relevant struggle for a lot of men today.
It is.
And dads, especially maybe.
And the great feminist writers have been trying to figure that out and talking about deconstructing and reconstructing. And so part of my course that you took was that like, we're in the confusing part, us guys. Like we're deconstructing, constructing. We're hopefully in the process of doing that and sorting it out. And you do that through writing, through film, through the arts, as much as you do it through the therapy room indirectly.
Yeah, absolutely. And, therapy isn't for everyone, right? Like
right.
It's, and as you said, sometimes you have men come and they don't come back, for whatever reason. It's like, it's a different experience. I remember talking to a friend a while ago about this idea that like maybe women have emotional privilege, right? Men have a lot of privileges still, like that's still very true in society. But, as I think you were alluding to, we've had these generations of feminists who have been writing books and creating theories and reframing what it means to be a woman and all the choices that you have and how you can dress and whether you can wear makeup or not wear makeup. And like, there's a lot of thought that's been put into that. Not that we've resolved it at all. I'm not trying to say that. But for a woman to show up in therapy and talk about her feelings is like, yeah, well, come on in. That's easy. Like, I think you gave a statistic too in the course about how, I forget what it was, but there's just many more women who are therapists. Like there are fewer men who are doing that work, right?
Yep.
And, there are fewer men who come to therapy. Like there are going to tend to be more women and so on. So we have this option of sitting and working with our feelings. And, I had a conversation with my husband at one point after we'd done some couples therapy. And it was like, he said something like, for you, therapy is this interesting intellectual exercise where you can like have questions about what you're doing and maybe change your behavior. And it's this kind of fun exercise. But for me, it feels threatening.
Yes.
In these different ways. Right. And I was like, well, if I felt that way about therapy, maybe I wouldn't go. So we have movies, we have stories, we have podcasts, right?
Yeah. Like what a way of putting it in emotional privilege. But there's something to that. It's like one of the fears that men have is walking into a situation and being either unskilled or de-skilled with what they're doing, and then like, that's sometimes what you see. As a couples therapist myself, like I know what it's like to be in a room when there is a highly emotionally articulate woman who's expressing herself. And then there's, let's say a man who's just like sort of dumbfounded, doesn't have the language, inexpressive. And part of the course was me trying to convey like, no, that's not a problem with you as a therapist or her. Like he's walking into a situation where he is withdrawing as protection, because that's better than speaking up and feeling like he's going to get it wrong or he's going to say, or like, pale in comparison to his emotionally articulate wife. And so it can be this really tense, you can see in the body language. It's like, oh my gosh, like I don't think I belong here. This is not my way of expressing myself. I can be
and if your wife is a therapist,
oh my gosh,
that's even worse.
Yeah, exactly. But you seem to be someone who's reflective enough to be like, whoa, what would it be like to walk into like how would you like to join, let's say your husband did, martial arts or something. Like how would you like to walk onto a martial arts mat and just say, okay, begin sparring, right? In some way, like,
right.
Not that therapy is at all like combative in any way, but you just walk in and feel like, what do I say to that? Like, how do I support my partner when she's crying? What do I say?
Yeah. So we've had no problem talking about this movie for an hour and a half.
Yeah, let's go for another hour and
a half.
Great
to think about these things, right? Is there anything else that you want to add in or anything you want to reflect on before we close?
I do want to recommend a book that I think it's been talked about, and I'm sure Christopher Nolan read it in preparation for this recent film, but it's by this psychiatrist named Jonathan Shea. And I read this book called Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. That was in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, he wrote a book called Odysseus in America, which I have not read, Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming. And so he's a psychiatrist who writes beautifully, and I think it's just a good read if people want to take this even a step farther. Maybe I'll just quickly plug the initiative that I'm working on with a colleague in Copenhagen. It's called Men's Therapy Hub, and what we're trying to do is build a directory of male therapists for male clients, for the reasons that we just talked about, because roughly 20-25% of therapists are male, and it's about representation, but also about possibility, right? It's hard to be what you can't see. And so we're just trying to build more community around it, and also be a referral source for people who are looking for male therapists, and build a community around men's mental health. And, we're men who are trying to build something and sort of take on that emotional burden, so it doesn't necessarily fall disproportionately on the overwhelming number of female therapists. So that's called Men's Therapy Hub. We have launched in the UK. We're launching this fall in the US. And so just take a look out for it as a therapy patient or as a therapist yourself. So hopefully that becomes a cool resource.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Julie. This was a lot of fun. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.